Well, welcome. I appreciate you joining us on this Sunday afternoon, Sunday evening. My name is Arnel Aguinaldo, and I'm going to give you a kind of a short introduction a little bit later. But this is the American Baseball Biomechanics Society in conjunction with the Society of American Baseball Research webinar on Major League Baseball Special Report on pitching injuries. So kind of give you, what to expect. The agenda. These real quickly, just want to shameless plug. These are our sponsors. This is made possible in part by our corporate sponsors, American Baseball Biomechanics Society. These are organizations who are on the cutting edge of motion capture, force play technology. Some of the technology that's used quite a bit in baseball today. So I plan to just kind of go through, give you my quick introduction, and I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves, where they're from, and how they were involved with the pitching, the report on Major League Baseball's report on pitching injuries. And then we'll go through, a few minutes, not a few minutes, but probably for the next 45 minutes or so, and just ask our panelists questions regarding details with the report, what they found, and recommendations as to plans for what we're going to do to mitigate the risk of injuries that we see in baseball. And then of course we'll open up the panel for Q&A. Now I do ask for those of you in attendance that we do have a chat room, so if you do have questions, go ahead and enter your question in the chat room. Our moderators would then forward the questions to me, and then I could ask them accordingly and go from there. All right. So without further ado, as I mentioned earlier, my name is Arnel Aguinaldo. I am an associate professor of biomechanics at Point Loma Nazarene University, where I'm also the director of our biomechanics lab in partnership with the San Diego Padres. So we provide all the biomechanics services exclusively to the San Diego Padres organization. And then I'm joined by an expert panel of Dr. Glenn Fleisig, Dr. Kristen Nicholson, Dr. Mike Reinold, and Sarris. And we want to go ahead and start with Glenn. Dr. Fleisig, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us where you're from and how you're involved with the MLB report.
Okay. Well, I live in Birmingham, Alabama, and as it says on the screen, I'm the biomechanics director at the American Sports Medicine Institute. I've been here a long time since many of you were born. Anyway, that's my day job. I'm also an advisor for Major League Baseball, and I'm on the research committee for Major League Baseball. So, Arnel, after the introductions, I could explain a little how this report came about.
Of course. All right. Dr. Nicholson?
I'm Kristen Nicholson. I am in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I'm director of Wake Forest Pitching Lab, also an assistant professor in orthopedic surgery. I was interviewed as one of the biomechanics specialist experts, I guess is the word they used, for the injuries report.
All right, thank you. Mike?
Hey, thanks so much for having me. My name is Mike Reinold. I am up in Boston at a facility that I own, Champion PT and Performance. It's basically a sports performance center. Tons of pro athletes and baseball players that are at our facility. So we get to train with them all winter. And then I've worked in baseball quite a bit over my career. I was head athletic trainer and physical therapist with the Red Sox for a while. I've consulted with the Cubs for a little bit, and I just recently finished up as senior medical advisor with the White Sox most recently. So yeah, I was interviewed as a PT ATC for this report from MLB.
All right. Eno.
Hi, I'm Sarris. I'm a writer for The Athletic, and no, they did not. They did not call me. I also feel a little bit out of my depth here on this panel. These are a bunch of the best brains in baseball, and me, idiot writer. But I look forward to talking about this stuff with you guys.
No, we look forward to your insights. All right, so Glenn, I'm going to start with you. Obviously, we've known for a while about the epidemic, right? The pitching-related injuries. Can you tell us, what instigated this conversation, this report I hate to call it a study.
Right.
Maybe it's more like a precursor from type. It's a more qualitative study at that. Can you explain to the audience just, how you got
Sure.
involved, what were the steps, and, go from
Yeah,
there?
in the introductions, I forgot to mention that Kristen and I are also on the board of American Baseball Biomechanics Society with you, Arnel. So, injuries have, as we see here, have been going up for years for pitching injuries, Tommy John injuries, etc. So, back in this graph, about 2010, 2014, earlier then, Major League Baseball had we had a study at that point, and we created something called PitchSmart.org at that time. And that was what we identified at that time was that the biggest new problem in 2010, 2014 was that the first generation of baseball players who were playing year-round baseball, one sport, were coming, and Little League Baseball and the other things didn't really have. We were trying to work with amateur baseball to get more limits because kids were coming in with damaged goods 10 years ago. Well, as the graph shows, that worked okay for a while, but the injury rates are going up and up again. I am not on the committee that I'm not one of the employees of the commissioner's office who did the study, but they are with us on the research committee. John D'Angelo, the vice president, and his group. So about a year ago, they decided to, before we could solve a problem, we got to know what the problem is. And they decided to do a consensus, a survey among experts. They intentionally did a broad types of people, but not Sarris. But they did a lot of people, but they did not do active current players either. They did retired players, people who work in front office, and people who work in medicine and science like us. And that's what they did. And then they released it in December 2024, kind of in conjunction with the winter meetings. Yeah.
So it was released in December. It is publicly available. We did send it out to our membership for the American Baseball Biomechanics Society. I don't know if it's possible if one of our moderators could potentially put up a link to the document for those of you who don't have it. It is some good reading, light reading, about 67 pages worth of just anecdotes, informations, and just responses from experts throughout Major League Baseball and those involved at the collegiate ranks as well. So, I'll start again with Glenn, and anyone on the panel could also chime in. What were the key important findings of this report? Again, it's not a study per se. It was just a consensus kind of survey. So what kind of 3 or 4 consensus, in terms of, the injuries that experts have reported in this particular study?
Okay, I'll start again. Again, this is not proof of anything. This is a consensus of opinions. And personally, I was very worried when we sent out this survey to 200 people. I thought we would get a report that with 200 different answers or 200 different opinions. And so it really is reassuring that a few things really showed up as again and again people were saying. And so what you have here on the screen, pitchers chasing velocity and trying to develop stuff to get, spin rate and things like that. And training and pitching always at max effort. These were the keys that got identified again and again. Again, not proven, but these experts from various backgrounds keep saying that these were the factors.
Okay. Mike, you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what this report did was it started the conversation, right? And I think it's a necessary first step for us to get this in writing, right? A summary of 200 people with diverse backgrounds that all are very familiar with what's been going on over the last couple of decades with injuries. So it's an excellent conversation starter. I'm not sure over the next 45 minutes if we're going to solve any additional problems tonight, right? That's the hard part of all this, but it's an initial first step to say that we at least have some consensus on really. I do think they picked out 3 of the better ones with velocity and stuff and max effort training. I think it's going to be a really neat way to kickstart our future efforts, I think, into reducing these injuries.
So the identified velocity stuff, max effort training, but these were just responses by those who participated in this survey. So, Kristen, for example, you have a biomechanics lab, you see pictures come in and, every day, at least routinely. Do you agree with, kind of the consensus here, velocity stuff and max effort training as kind of the primary factors that contribute to this increase in injury rates in baseball?
Yes, I would agree that those are the primary factors. I think there's a lot more that plays into it that we don't fully understand, but I think they kind of all lead back to these three things. So obviously, I think throwing while fatigued is a big issue and leading to a lot of these injuries, but throwing while fatigued is a symptom of max effort pitching all the time and trying to hit max velocity and developing stuff. So I think they kind of landed in the right 3 points here, and then mentioned kind of those other contributing factors as well.
So I want to start off with velocity, velo, the chase, the need for speed, chasing, your max effort for every pitch in the bullpen or in game and non-game situation. So we've been following velo for years, right? It's one of the basic statistic, and then it's now built into some of these SABR metrics. So in your opinion, in the StatCast era, how is this focus towards velocity, pitch velocity? Has it shifted, or are we just more of hyper focused because of the injuries? In your opinion, what do you think is the issue that we're seeing here with returns to velo?
I think to some extent we're pushing our athletes to the upper bounds of their potential right now, and I think to some extent injury is going to come with that. Now, do we have a problem? Probably. I was a little disappointed with the report because, Dr. Nicholson just said it. Like the role of fatigue, I thought was not discussed enough, and of course that is a symptom of throwing closer to your max, which I think is one of Glenn Fleisig's study on throwing closer to their max. That's something we're seeing more and more of, and that's related to fatigue and that's related to injury. I would have liked the report to maybe summarize the best findings we have so far and really delve into the progress that has been made. Dr. Nicholson has some great studies, and Dr. Fleisig does too. And there's stuff out there that could start the conversation as well as just sort of recording people's opinions. I wanted a little bit more meat on the bone, but I do appreciate that it was the start of an effort and there's going to be more after this. I hope that baseball funds some research and puts some funding behind this effort, because I think that'll be a huge part of pushing us forward. But yes, the chase for velo is real. Yeah. It has gone up on every pitch, and it is definitely a big part of this of this problem.
Yes, yeah, definitely a conversation starter. Is by no means a conclusive. It wasn't really an analysis, right? As I mentioned earlier. Yeah. So sticking to the topic with velocity, and this is actually highlighted in the report that there seems to be, according to the evidence that's reported in literature by Dr. Nicholson, myself, Dr. Fleisig, a correlation between velocity and what's known as elbow valgus torque, what some call elbow stress. But I think it's also important to understand what exactly are we talking about when we refer to something like elbow stress or elbow valgus torque. And I'm going to pose this question to Dr. Nicholson because she's a matter expert. She understands kind of the biomechanics involved and what's called the inverse dynamics, the calculations go into it. You found in one study that pitch velocity was a contributing factor to elbow valgus torque. But if I recall, it was under 30% shared variance. Can you comment on the role velocity plays in the actual estimation of something like valgus torque, elbow valgus torque?
Yeah, so you called it elbow stress, and that's kind of something that we all synonymous, elbow valgus torque, elbow stress. We're looking at how much stress is on the UCL, which is leading to these UCL injuries. But what we're reporting as elbow valgus torque is just a calculated number, and it's calculated based on how long the forearm is, how fast the forearm is moving, and where it is in relation to the body, essentially. And so the faster you move your arm, aka the faster you pitch the ball, the higher the torque is going to be. And that's just the nature of how you calculate elbow varus torque, and it's kind of the best estimate we have right now for how much stress is being put on the elbow. But there's lots of other things that go into protecting the UCL, such as the forearm pronator muscles and arm fatigue, and the elbow gapping space between the forearm and the humerus. And so again, it's just a calculation to give us kind of a guess on how much stress we're putting on the elbow. And because arm speed goes into that calculation, the higher the arm speed, the higher the ball velocity, the higher the elbow valgus torque. And so in that study that you alluded to, pitch velocity was the most influential factor. It had 28.4 relative influence. But then other things like maximum shoulder external rotation, your lead leg ground reaction force, shoulder abduction at foot strike, and maximum humeral rotation velocity all contributed as well. And so it's slightly encouraging that those mechanics also contribute to it. So perhaps adjusting your mechanics can help reduce that elbow valgus torque and the stress on the elbow, and it's not solely tied to pitch velocity.
Arnel,
Right.
sorry, can I just add to
Go
that?
ahead. Yeah, go for it.
I just want to completely agree with Kristen. I just want to say sometimes we report it as elbow valgus torque, sometimes elbow varus torque, but it's the same thing. It means push versus pull. It's just, the terminologies are different, but it's the same thing we're talking about. And as Dr. Nicholson said, the elbow valgus torque is what is needed at the elbow to move the arm forward, and it's a combination of the stress on the UCL, the Tommy John ligament, the stress on the bones, and also the stress on the forearm muscles. And we're talking about fatigue before. If the muscles are fatigued, they can't do their job, and that's when the ligament might be more susceptible to injury. Yeah.
For those of you in the audience, I put an image here of just a picture of a former Royal, former Padre. I think his name is Heath. And that little circle there represents the valgus torque. It's a mathematical entity that places the medial structures of the elbow, aka UCL, into a much of tension. And so we through our software and through our algorithms, we're able to estimate what that torque is. And given the proliferation of markless motion capture and IMUs, now coaches and players have the ability to estimate this torque, for every single pitch, whether it's during the game or in the bullpen. However, one thing, and I've been doing, studying elbow valgus for years in our lab as well. But if I recall, there really is no evidence in the scientific literature that directly links the whether it's cumulative or not, the valgus torque and actual incidence of injuries. We assume that there are, but as I recall, there's limited studies or limited data in the scientific literature that links valgus torque to injury.
Arnel, I want to add that
am I correct?
About 2010, Dr. Ans did a small study with 23 people, and they found that the ones who got hurt did have higher torque. But we, with Major League Baseball, myself and Major League Baseball just finished a study with 300 people, which we followed for like 5 years. And this is in review at the journal. But I could tell you the answer is that the pitchers who got a Tommy John injury and had surgery had the higher torque than those who didn't. So we have a big study coming out proving this very important point that you're talking about.
Okay. All right. Mike, do you want to chime in? I mean, I know you published some study. We're going to talk about weighted ball programs here in a few minutes, but one of the response variables we were looking at was varus torque or /valgus torque, right? What are your thoughts on its relationship to the injuries that we're seeing in baseball, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense, right? I think intuitively we knew that. It's good to see that Dr. Fleisig is going to start publishing some things to actually get that out in the literature. I think that'd be amazing. The other interesting part here too is that, when the current state of baseball training right now is different, where people are trying to push their velocity at almost all times at every point in their career, in season, off season, over the course of their development. They're always pushing that velocity development. So you can do a study that shows people with high torque obviously get more injuries, but I think the other thing we're seeing is that the within subject changes in torque from these training programs are probably something that would be very interesting to kind of watch. And again, I don't know if we can study that. That's a really hard study to technically build, right? But to see what those changes in those torques, and maybe that's why some people can handle it more than others. And I don't know if we know those answers. But for me, I think that's one thing that I'm a little bit more conscious of when we're working with our players here is they're trying to maximize their velocity in every which way possible. So everything Kristen just said about potential mechanisms, they're trying to improve all of those things. And that becomes cumulative with torque, and the within subject changes are enormous just from year to year.
So in other words, if
I did
you're
want to add
chasing
one thing about
velocity,
this.
oh, sorry,
I
go
did
ahead,
want to I did want to add one thing about this. It's a story that Glenn tells a lot, but this idea that if you test the elbow in cadavers, there's a certain sort of number. I think it's like 45 Newton meters of elbow valgus torque will break the cadaver's UCL. And yet we know that there's many more times that amount of stress put on the elbow in a typical major league motion. And so the answer is that, obviously the muscles around the UCL and even the bones will absorb some of that stress. And as much as 67% of the stress that comes from a normal throw will actually be absorbed by these muscles. And that's why I hate coming back to it over and over again. But I think fatigue is so important because we sometimes, I think, almost fetishize this ligament. It is the thing that breaks, but it is only maybe a third of the thing that is absorbing stress in the moment. And so just really focusing on that. I have a couple other ideas that'll stem from that idea, but that's something that Glenn talks about all the time. And I just think it's helpful to also understand the role of elbow valgus torque in the bigger picture, which is the entire arm,
Right, exactly. So the idea is not so much to minimize that magnitude, but to meet the demand of that magnitude. If the players are trying to maximize velo, you're getting 150 Newton meters of valgus torque, and that's what's associated with throwing, a 96 mile per hour four seam. Then what can we do with the athlete to meet that demand, right? Like the FPN muscles, etc. So that's a great conversation to have, and then I think the research, we'll talk about these in a few minutes, on directions that we should go, those of us who are in this space in biomechanics. I kind of want to not really shift gears, but since I got Eno here, we're going to talk about stuff, because that was one of the things that was perceived as a contributor to these injuries. So, could you talk a little bit about Stuff Plus? First of all, what it is, what it involved, what goes into it, and how potentially it could influence the risk of pitching-related injuries.
Yeah, well, stuff is just a number that appraises the physical characteristics of a player's pitches and their release points, just basically the physical characteristics of their pitches, and sort of puts them on a scale where 100 is the average pitcher. And I developed it with Max Bay, who's now with the Dodgers. And one of the things that was surprising to us was, how important release point was. And so what you find is that players really benefit from having surprising movement profiles. And I could see that actually leading to more stress, because what you're asking them to do is produce a fastball that looks like it comes from a different release point. You're trying to ask them to make shapes that look surprising given their release point. And so maybe that's running against some of their biomechanic, true points, like what they should be doing. Maybe they're working against their body in some way to produce these shapes. And so, but the one thing is this, so the genie's out of the box. Every team has a stuff number. Every team is using their stuff number to help coach their players, help, most of the independent labs like Driveline has a stuff number, and, they're using that type of analysis to improve their pitchers. And I don't think you can stop that, because it's the question is, how do I be good? And here's one of the ways we can answer that. And so the only thing that I would say, you can't ask a player to throw softer. You can't ask him to throw crappier stuff. And I will say that some of the things that are coming out of, we have some of the pressure on analysts and the analytics is to make the argument for other things and to show that these other things can be important. And so Louis Polis just recently wrote a really interesting thing that, like, every inning that a starter pitches reduces the bullpen's ERA the next day, by a certain amount of points. And that makes intuitive sense. But when you argue that and you put it on paper, you start to change minds in analytics departments, and you start change minds with the GM, and they start changing some of their practices and some of their incentives. So you're basically showing them, what's the incentive of having my pitcher go deep? It's this. So I think there is some pressure on the analytics community to go beyond Stuff Plus and start talking about, the role of, like I said, fatigue, the role of just depth, and what we can, if we can make the argument for these other things to sort of help baseball shift its incentives.
One of the things that go into this stuff is spin rate. We have the ability through TrackMan and Hawkeye to get spin rates for different types of pitches. And I'll open this question to both Glenn and Dr. Nicholson and Dr. Fleisig with regards to, we talked about velo, but what about all of these other horizontal, vertical break, spin rates? Have you found in your, maybe some pilot testing or some data that ultimately you're going to publish, any relationship to either an elbow or shoulder injury risk with regards to meeting, improving or optimizing stuff? Start with you,
I was going to say,
Dr. Fleisig.
I don't really have anything. I was going to defer to Kristen, but we have not looked at that yet. I just, in theory, and I also want to hear what Mike Reinold thinks, but in theory, there's controversy in sports medicine about whether trying to get more spin and stuff on pitches increases the risk of injury or not. Kind of alluding to some of the things Eno says. Some doctors think that when you're trying to get extra spin on the ball, you are putting more stress in the muscles in your forearm, and therefore more stress on the ligament. Some other people, including me, think that that's not what's happening. I think what's happening is when you try to put more stress and get more spin, if you try and get more spin, you do more force on your muscles. And on that particular pitch, the forearm muscles are actually, in my opinion, covering up and protecting the UCL. I think what's happening is when you're trying to pitch with a lot of stuff and spin, you are going to get to fatigue sooner. And then it's not those early pitches where you're doing a lot of spin. It's the later pitches where your forearm is tired. And as Eno knows, a lot of times in the press, when some pitcher has a forearm problem, that's a precursor to UCL injury. So Kristen could talk about the spin rate, but I also want to hear what Mike thinks about whether the muscles are putting more stress on the UCL or the fatigue muscles are the problem.
All right, go ahead, Mike.
Okay, I'll jump in and then hand it back to Kristen. But Glenn, I think you're 100% right. So we know, like, and it's shown right here on the slide, we know that the torque is not more on off-speed pitches, right? It's, if anything, it's less, right? Depending on what the pitch is. So we know torque's similar, but when you do start manipulating the ball more and you do start trying to change your pronation, your supination, your grip strength, where you're applying grip on the ball, like there's so many factors that we're doing, and we do that over and over and over again, working on this stuff. I would agree 100% with you, Dr. Fleisig, that that fatigues out the forearm. It's very obvious to those in the training room and the PT clinics that when somebody's learning a new pitch or somebody is going through bullpens where they're, working on, a sweeper, for example, or a slider, and it's a new pitch for them. They have a significant amount of forearm fatigue. So we know that that's probably going to happen. And you see the evolution of the game where we're having more off-speed pitching, and again, more people focusing just in their bullpens. A day 2, day 3 bullpen, wherever it may be in season, they're not just doing it to get loose or to stay sharp or to work on location. They're doing it to enhance spin metrics and pitch design, and using TrackMan and Rapsodo to be able to do that at all times. So I think that's probably the biggest factor. And again, I guess you could argue chicken or the egg, this whole concept here. Is it fatigue, or is it just that we're max effort throwing at all times and that's causing the fatigue? I think that's where it all comes into play, but I would agree, Glenn.
Oh, just by the way, the numbers that I have up on the screen is from a recent article published in AJSM, American Journal of Sports Medicine, out of Rush. Our very own Brittany Dowling was involved in this study. They looked at different pitches, looked at torque and cumulative torque, but they did find that spin rate wasn't, didn't have no effect, or was not different. Between, the elbow varus torque was not different between the different spin rates. There was no relationship there. But it just shows that there are other factors involved, like horizontal, vertical breaks and things like that, that potentially can go into the development of valgus torque or the loading rate of valgus torque. So, Dr. Nicholson, do you want to kind of piggyback on what's been said already?
I don't have a whole lot to add. I would just agree that the spin and the break and pitch design are fatiguing the forearm more so than directly related to the amount of torque. And it's not published or nothing official, but we did do like a forearm specific strengthening protocol, and we saw that the forearm muscles increased in cross-sectional area, but it had no effect on ball metrics. And so that would kind of lead to the argument that it's not necessarily that you need a stronger forearm or it's putting more stress on it, but that perhaps you would just fatigue faster the more you spin and break the ball. And then I would also agree with Mike that it's directly related to the max pitching all the time. During the off season, that's when they're going to work on developing another pitch or increasing their stuff, and so they're throwing max effort all the time in order to gain this development. We also have a study that's in review where we saw that decreasing effort does not necessarily change your biomechanics, but we didn't look at ball flight metrics, but I would argue and assume that decreasing effort probably does affect the ball flight metrics. So if your goal is to develop stuff and work on your ball flight metrics, you're going to have to be throwing max effort all the time. And so I think those two combined are how the stuff is contributing to the injury epidemic.
That's actually a perfect segue to max effort. A lot of questions regarding fatigue and workload, and really workload management. And one of the issues that I have, and I'm sure many of you in the audience have an issue with pitch counts and innings pitch. And in baseball, are we truly capturing workload? I mean, is there another metric with all the technology that we have? There's some kind of optimized model that we should be using to, first of all, capture workload in game, bullpens, non-game situations, and then be able to manage it accordingly so we can begin to figure out ways that we can mitigate the effects of fatigue. So I'll start with Glenn, Dr. Fleisig, and get kind of, this was reported in the study here that max effort throwing is involved not just in games, but in all situations where we anecdotally see pitchers in our lab or in the bullpen, just because they're pitch designing and doing all kinds of things, trying to just throw their fastball, throw whatever their pitch with maximum intensity. In your opinion, are we actually capturing their workload,
this is
whether acute or chronic?
This is a really good question, and so many years ago, a company called Modus made the Modus sleeve, and that was then bought by a company called Driveline. Well, Driveline, and they have the Driveline Pulse. And there's been a lot of research on
Pulse,
this
right.
about how much stress is on the elbow. It's a sleeve that measures elbow, indirectly measures elbow torque. And there's been a lot of research. Brittany Dowling has done the most on how much torque and how much should these partial effort throws, these bullpen throws, and these half effort throws count, and when you're doing the whole workload. Mike Reinold and I and Brittany Dowling have published some research recently trying to redesign the interval throwing program, which is the rehab throwing program where you throw at different distances and different intensities. And in the rehab, Mike could talk more about that. Different throws count different amounts. But my take home point of this is if you throw a pitch at 90 miles per hour like I do. No, I'm just kidding. If you throw pitches at 90 miles per hour, if that's your fastball, and then you throw a couple of pitches at 80 miles per hour, let's say 80 miles per hour, your warm-up pitches or whatever, that warm-up pitch is not 8/9 as damaging. It's a lot less. You think of your ulnar collateral ligament like a rubber band. If you keep stretching it as hard as possible, it's going to eventually tear. But if you kind of stretch it with half effort, you could pretty much do that all day. So there's the equation for using the Driveline Pulse that Mike and Brittany and I developed. The faster throws count a lot more. The full effort throws count a lot more. There's a math equation, but it's not like the partial effort throws shouldn't count at all. They should be in the equation, but they count less.
Mike?
Yeah, Arnel, it was funny when we were coming back from COVID, we were trying to estimate workloads over the summer before, the world came back, before baseball came back to see where we were at. And one of the things we came up with, just looking through the data that we found was that the in-game workloads were probably no more than 1/3 the total workloads that we have with the players. So again, it's funny we say, like, oh, we have to limit pitches, you can't throw more than 100 pitches, those sorts of things. That to me, that's the tip of the iceberg. And then in season is even more so the tip of the iceberg for me. So I have a unique scenario where I own a sports performance center in the off season where people train. And what players are doing now would blow your mind if you spent a winter with me. They are throwing max effort all year. They're doing so much. And, it's funny, you could argue all the great research by Glenn and ASMI, 20, 25 years ago kind of showed that, you couldn't pitch for more than, let's say, 8 months out of a year, right? That was one of the big findings that Dr. Fleisig published, but now we have people long tossing and weighted balls and things that are more stressful than pitching almost every day in the off season. And we always ask the kids, we're like, hey, would you throw a bullpen 4 times a week all year? And the kids will say, no, of course not. We can't do that. And I'd say, why? They say, well, that's too much. That's overload. I'm like, well, what you're doing is worse. Right. And we have this conversation with them. So everybody's doing it now. It's crazy to me. So the max intent throughout the year, I think, is by far the number one thing. And I think my unique perspective of seeing these people in the off season has really made that obvious to me, right? And think about these athletes, right? They live 2 lives. They are controlled by the team for half the year, and they do their own thing for half the year, right? And sometimes it doesn't add up. Sometimes it doesn't go together. And what we're finding here is just like any other principle, we have to periodize this load, and we're not doing that well, right? So just one quick example, and then I'll stop talking. But I also help Northeastern University's baseball team, and one of the things we do at the beginning of fall ball with the coaching staff is we talk about each of the pitchers on the staff and say, what do they need the most this winter? Do they need to just prepare for the season? Do they need to work on pitch design? Do they need to work on velocity? And we periodize that training for that athlete for the winter because you can't do everything all at once. And I think that by far is the biggest change in the last 20 years. Our big leaguers didn't used to pick up a ball until January. 15 years ago,
Yep.
right? That wasn't that long ago, right? And now they're long tossing with weighted balls in October. It's crazy.
Right, and we see that this is actually in the report that spike in injuries, not necessarily UCL injuries, but just injuries in general among pitchers in March and April. those who gone into the IL or those complaining of inflammation or pain. And yeah, you're right. I mean, we see this across baseball. The work that they're doing in the off season that is really not controlled. They're doing their own thing. They're going to these facilities. So yeah, and perhaps once we start talking about strategies, that's one of the ways that we could probably standardize this in terms of periodization and deload and ramping up and things like that. I do want to, because you brought it up, weighted ball programs, because this was also in the report, and there are different training strategies that are out there that potentially could increase velo and potentially mitigate risks. So Mike, I actually have one of your studies. We talked about this before, and the reason why I like to highlight your study, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the only randomized control trial that looked at weighted ball programs and look at the effects of Veristark. Am I correct?
Yes, that is correct. Yes.
So real quickly, what did you find? Like, what are the benefits and potentially risks involved from a biomechanical perspective, from an injury risk perspective with these programs?
Yeah, what we actually found that we had two groups, a weighted ball group and a control group that didn't use weighted balls. And again, it was kids at our facility in high school. They're in strength and conditioning, they're in arm care programs with us, they're working with their coaching staff. So a real holistic multi, approach to these athletes. And we found that the weighted ball group did go up in velocity, but not everybody did. And that's, an interesting part. Some players went down, some didn't change at all, but statistically, if you look at the means of the two groups, that group did go up, right? There were plenty of kids in the control group that also went up, but again, it was more in the weighted ball group. But we did have almost a 25% injury rate. And again, what I think is very interesting is that I don't see a lot of injuries from weighted balls when they're doing a weighted ball program. I see it the next season after they've done a comprehensive program and they're now pitching on that. And I think that's because our main finding that I think alarmed me, but also surprised me, was that players gained external rotation, so layback, over the course of a weighted ball program. And at first, I was really nervous. I thought we were tearing capsules or subscaps or lats, and heck, they are, right? There are plenty of people that are doing that. But what we actually found just acutely in our follow-up study was that there was this really rapid, just after a handful of weighted ball throws, you get a rapid increase in external rotation, probably because they're desensitizing their GTOs, right? Their proprioceptors to allow more layback. And then that's more velocity, that's more stress, right? And that's kind of how it all kind of plays together. But I'll be honest though, with everybody on this panel and in attendance here, weighted balls aren't evil. They just change the stress. And a lot of athletes think they're like free throws, like they don't count towards their workloads because they're it's just a training device. It's not pitching. But what I actually think it's just the opposite. So I think that's part of what we're finding is, again, we're just overdosing. We're just not doing it as best as we can.
This was actually brought up in the report that there's a decline in cardiovascular and endurance training among pitchers, right? I mean, pitchers back in the day, 20, 30 years ago, used to be able to go, long innings because the roster, the rotations were smaller, right? So they had to pitch more, but they were built up accordingly. Now with weighted ball programs and all of these other, plyos and et cetera, which are built to, increase velo, increase more of that anaerobic, to kind of mix, metabolic pathways, where now the aerobic capacity of your pitchers, and that would probably be a good research study to do, measure the metabolic energy capacities of these players today and see how that chips forward. So Dr. Nicholson, you and I have worked on energy flow and mechanical energy. Are you kind of maybe shifting forward, maybe including more metabolic, VO2 max type testing among pitchers?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, I agreed that was an interesting, finding or reporting of the whatever we're calling it, not a study, but report. And has some merit to it. But I'm not aware of any kind of endurance training or metabolic testing that's going on amongst our players. I do know that we focus our weight training a lot on like functional movement and being able to move, not just being super big and strong, which leans a little bit towards the longevity and endurance training versus like pure strength and max effort for a short period of time. But yeah, I think that's something that we could consider and definitely open the discussion for that, but I'm not aware that we are implementing it as of right now.
Cool. That could be, one of the initiatives for recommendations to move forward. One of the main contributors that was reported in the study or the survey was previous injury, right? Injury history was a contributor to, maybe another Tommy John or just injury in general. I'll open up to the panel. What's currently being done on the amateur levels to monitor workload and to, these different strategies to minimize risk, because it's all over the map, as you can imagine. So I don't know, Eno, if you want to chime in and go ahead.
Yeah, just because I have 2 kids in Little League right now, so I'm really appreciative of the efforts like Pitch Smart and the pitch limits, and I think that was a good step because there had been some massive pitch numbers with kids where they might be in Little League Friday night starter, and then their travel ball team wants them to pitch on Sunday again. And you might have a kid, throwing 200, plus pitches in a weekend where you're like, that's not good. And I'm not into that at all. But I also think I've seen, because I've been a coach on these teams, and I've even attended some seminars. Tom House has like a set of recommendations that he goes out and he gives to coaches that then can coach the little leagues, and I'm appreciative of all that. But like we're all amateurs, like we are all trying our best to protect these kids, but we're all amateurs, and so asking us to like impart the right mechanics, I think on these young pitchers, like if there are some like really top level takeaways that we can do, that's possible, but it has to be really simple messaging. It has to be really effective, simple messaging. And I think that it might be more important to sort of talk about fatigue in another way, which is we've been talking about a little bit here, which is like if you wanted, I know this is like already going ahead in the rundown a little bit, but if there's an idea that I have, the one idea I would have is actually that I think we need to throw more. And I'm not talking about pitching more. I'm talking about throwing more, because the one thing that I think people are afraid of in little leagues now is any throwing. So, my son today just pitched 50 pitches because that's the number. 50 pitches when he had to be taken out. He wasn't built up for 50. I mean, he hadn't, well, what had he done all week was just batting practice and fielding practice, and there was no bullpen where it was like, let's get you to 20 pitches on Monday so that on Friday or Saturday you can throw 50. So we're so afraid of pitching now, and it's something you can see is we've reduced how often people pitch in the minor leagues. It's something we've reduced the number of pitches people throw. We've reduced the number of innings they throw. We've reduced all of this, and it hasn't helped. And so I want to normalize throwing instead of pitching. And I think this does walk a line. We've talked about weighted balls and, high effort, high intensity. That's, I would consider pitching. If you're doing pitch design and you need to throw it 100% to get that right shape and get that right feel, that you have to consider your acute day, and there has to be more chronic buildup, I think. I don't think we're great at that balance because we're so kind of afraid of pitching that we don't do as much. Like I know major league bullpens now in between starts are as short as 10 pitches. And yes, some of those are high intensity, but should we have them also throw another 20, 80% pitches, easy pitches to build up the chronic workload? So anyway, the balance in fatigue is the acute and the chronic. I think we've been really fascinated with the acute, and we've been really on top of the acute. I don't know that we've been as good about the chronic. And so it sounds silly to be like, I think one of my solutions might be to throw more, but I mean throwing, not pitching. Yep. I mean, sort of the buildup of that.
Throwing a football, right? Or, yep.
Yeah, like just, just like, easing into it. And so I think we
Mhm.
could have something where we're like, hey, if you are going to be a Friday night starter and you are going to throw 80 pitches on Friday, let that not be the only time you throw all week. Like have a regular schedule of throwing that leads to Friday night being your big night. So yeah, some work on the chronic side, I think would be something that I would be advocating
Build up the
for.
chronic workload. Yeah,
Yeah.
100% agree. Dr.
Yeah,
Fleisig?
I mean, what you're saying is not crazy. In fact, it's what people were saying 10, 15 years ago. I talked with John Smoltz and Leo Mazzoni, who was the pitching coach for the Braves back in the day. And I mean, the message is out there in sports medicine that people should do more throwing or sub max pitching, not all max pitching. They just need to be doing throwing.
Yeah.
You can't sit on the couch and then it's your pitching day, jump up and throw your 100 pitches as hard as you can, and then go sit down for 6 days. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah. And just to be clear, that is sort of what happens for these kids, because the kids, we're not pros. So like, they have their game on Friday and like, they may not throw all week otherwise. So, I also just wanted to give shout outs to, I'm heavily influenced this by Casey Mulholland, who's doing a sort of response piece to that's coming out right now. He's at Kinetic Pro. And then also Dr. Mike Son, who's with the
Cubs.
the
The Cubs.
The
Cubs,
Cubs.
trying to implement like just what we're talking about here, like really trying to dial in the acute to chronic and like really track workloads and see if they can do something as an organization about this.
Mike, Dr. Nicholson, you guys see, high school and, collegiate players or even the youth players. What do you think, is currently being done and, what needs to change in your opinion in terms of acute chronic workload management in the non-Major League Baseball ranks? Mike?
Yeah, I'll take this one first. I mean, we deal with a lot of this, and what the number one thing we try to do with the players that we are fortunate enough to get to help is we educate. And I think that's a big part of working with us at our facility is we teach them these things. And one of the first things we teach them is what we kind of call like the 4 buckets of how to, become a better pitcher, throw harder, that sort of thing. And when you find out that throwing is just one of those buckets, right? And then the other buckets are age and maturation, strength and conditioning, and then proper arm care programs. Those are our 4 buckets right there. We see that there are a ton of things that these kids can do that will help them throw harder and better that aren't stressful on the arm, right? And that's one of the things we start to actually educate them on is you have to have that. And what tends to happen, right, is that one winter you'll pick one thing like, oh, I'm going to go to the gym this winter and I'm going to get stronger next year. And then, okay, that worked a little bit, but you still want more. So next winter, you're like, you know what? I'm going to do lessons all winter. I'm going to do a bullpen once a week all winter, right? And what we don't do is we don't take what the professional and even the collegiate level has, but it's access to all 4 of those buckets at the same time. So find a facility near you that does that, right? We're not the only ones, right? There's tons out there that does that, where you have a proper strength and conditioning program that works on the things that can help develop you, that you have proper arm care programs that will actually get their arm strong, right? And your velocity is going to go up as you age and mature, as you grow and as you get older, right? Those are probably the 2 biggest factors right there, just in getting their velocity up. So for us, it's about education with that. And then from there, we teach them all about throwing and how that works. And we teach them about the stress. And we have periodized days, like to Eno's point, like over the course of the week, we have to have high days and low days, right? We have to build those in. So we try to structure that with the people there. But I think getting that out to the masses and understanding is there. But remember, people want to push the envelope every day, right? Otherwise, they feel like they're not getting better, right? And don't get me wrong, I do the same thing with my golf swing, right? I'm maniacal about my golf swing. These kids are maniacal about their pitching, right? So I get it. I understand what they're going. They think if they're not working on it today, they're going to fall behind. And I hate to say it, but this is how players are rewarded now. They used to be rewarded based on durability, right? It was an honor to go 200 innings. I remember popping bottles of champagne in the training room when a guy came out of a game when he got 200 innings for the first time in his career. And now that's like, it's not even a thought, right? So we used to reward pitchers and give them longer contracts based on durability. Now it's just all velocity and stuff. So, you know, again, I'm not one to fight the system. That's the game now. So the more we can educate and teach them all these other safe ways to develop themselves as a pitcher, where they don't have to do max intent throwing at all times, to me, those are the kids that succeed, and those are the kids I want to draft.
Dr. Nicholson?
I don't have much to add in terms of the chronic versus acute workload. I mean, I do think it is a contributing factor, and I'm definitely more on the biomechanics side of things. But I hear our pitching coaches talk all the time how I believe it's the Japanese players are throwing a lot more than we do. That they kind of work under this system of they have a lot of non-pitching throwing that they do, and then they tend to be injured less when they're in the MLB system. And so I get asked kind of like why that is, and if we should implement that within our players. And I do think it has a lot of merit, and definitely perhaps a shift in the current acceptance, but something that maybe an initiative that could come out of this as well.
Perfect segue. Your timing is great, Kristen. So yeah, we're now to the part of the webinar. We're going to talk about recommendations. Like this is I believe page 66 or 67. So let's start with you, Dr. Fleisig. What are the next steps?
Well,
What needs to be done? I know there are research initiatives, but I also think there's also rule changes that potentially could be proposed. So what are the next steps here?
Okay. Well, there's some rule changes that could be proposed in amateur baseball, as you're saying, but I've been biting my tongue. I'm really excited to tell you something right now. Okay. And we've been working on a study behind the scenes for the past year. You don't know about this yet, Arnel or or Mike. But I explained it this past week at the SABR conference. And so I have a new idea. I've been banging my head saying exactly what we're saying here for 10 years, telling people, the coaches, the doctors, the players, don't throw every throw as hard as possible. And we've just been banging our heads against the wall. It hasn't been working. I got a new idea, which we got funded by Major League Baseball, and we tested in our biomechanics lab right here. We had 20 college pitchers come into the lab here, and we had them throw the regular baseball full effort pitching, and we had them throw bigger and heavier balls. Okay, we were just talking about how weighted balls might be bad, but I mean, think about it. Today's baseball pitchers are bigger and stronger and throwing harder than ever before. The 5-ounce baseball in their hand is like a tennis ball or a wiffle ball to the guy from 20 or 40 years ago. So we did a study in the biomechanics lab here, testing a theory that if we had high-end college pitchers throwing 6-ounce baseballs or slightly bigger baseballs than the 5-ounce baseball, what would happen? And sure enough, it worked out well in that when they pitched, the velocity was less with the bigger or heavier ball, but their arm speed was slower, and as a result, their elbow torque was less throwing the heavier ball. Again, so again, we've been trying to voluntarily or try to get people to put less torque in their elbow. I think today's huge big guys, what I'm proposing here is maybe Major League Baseball should consider changing from a 5-ounce baseball to a 6-ounce baseball. One little ounce seems to slow down the ball, the speed, and less torque. And we're going to do some more work with Major League Baseball to try to see if this might be a solution.
So that would be a rule change, and that brought up from a research initiative you're working on.
Yeah, I was at the at SABR. I saw your talk, Glenn. That was very
Okay.
interesting finding, and I congratulate you on thinking outside the box, and that I also did share some of you had some commenters that were a little bit more nervous about it. And the one thing I'm nervous just about is this may be true the first time they sort of encounter this ball, but I wonder what happens later when they're all training to throw the 6-ounce ball and they get their arm speed back up to where it is now. Like,
Right.
is it is it something that would just push us back 5 years, and then 5 years from now we're in the same space because they've all
Again,
trained for the 6-ounce ball? So
yeah,
that's an open question that we wouldn't know, but I wonder.
right.
You had some thoughts about it there. I
I just
wonder if
want
you
to
could
say,
share.
I just want to say, I don't have all the answers. I just know the immediate
Yeah,
effect of throwing it.
yeah.
Now, I do not think that after time they will be throwing the 6-ounce baseball at the same velocity as the 5-ounce baseball any more than they could throw a 2-pound baseball. The thing is heavier.
Mm.
I think they might try to get their torque up, the amount of torque, but I don't know how to play out. This is an initial study. More work needs to be done, and like you're saying, trying to think outside the box and try to change the scenario instead of trying to change the behaviors. And maybe, I'm excited that we might have something here.
Yeah. I agree
I
100% that like you have to change
oh,
the
sorry.
incentive structures and you have to change what's around it. Like you can't like I feel badly for you for all those years of trying to tell them, don't throw so hard. It's just not, I know it's not gonna happen, like they there's money on the table, they're gonna throw as hard as they can every time, and even my
Right.
my kids when they're on the mound, you can't tell them not to try and throw as hard as they want. There's something about competition. They get up, they want to throw hard. So changing the implement seems like a good idea. I had an idea
Yeah.
that we could change some roster rules. That's the same idea, which is like change the rules around it to incentivize. The one thing that could be simple is there's an active roster that people have. They have to choose 5 pitchers or 6 pitchers for the game tonight. That puts pressure on them to pick guys that will go longer in the game. But I think it also changes the dynamic between the pitcher and the organization, where they now have to really dial in that acute to chronic workload situation. And they are on the side of the pitcher in like, we have to keep you healthy and we have to say somebody can't pitch tonight. And so therefore you're on the down list because look at this, look at our numbers, look at what our workload numbers say about where you are right now. You really need a down night, like, and so on and so forth. So I think that could change some of the conversation between the player and the organization about health, possibly. But we could do a lot of these things in concert because we obviously have such a big problem that we may want to attack this from every angle we can.
Real quickly, I know we're still on the subject of rule changes, and this is related to it. There was a question in the chat regarding pitch clock. And at least the initial numbers, the data that's been published, says that pitch clock really has little to no influence on the incidence of injuries. So do you guys agree?
I need to say, I did a study with Major League Baseball that did not get published that showed no difference in the pitching injury rates. Well, pitching injury rates continued to go up at the same rate they were going up. And the introduction of the pitch clock, pitch timer, technically, did not bump up or bump down the injury rates. And then there was
No
more
effect.
recently a published report where someone else also showed that. So scientifically, pitch timer has not had any positive or negative effect on injury rates of pitchers.
Okay.
I have a really hard time with that one. I know that's what you found, and I totally respect the work, but it's just you're asking them to do more work in less time. It's like there's like basic math there where you just like that should lead to more fatigue quicker. I don't know how to square that. I'm not saying you guys are wrong. I'm just saying I don't like there's the 2 fundamental facts here that are kind of beating each other in me in the head. I don't get it, but if that's what we found, then that's fine.
Or maybe it's just too early. I mean, we're at what, 2
Yeah,
seasons
no,
in
no. I
since
mean,
pitch
we're not
clock,
asking them to
right?
throw
So I
more
don't know.
pitches per minute, or I mean, more pitches in the game or anything. They're throwing the same number of pitches
In less
with
time, though.
in less time, and then physiologically, it looks like they have enough time for their body to recover between pitches, whether it's 15 seconds or 28 seconds. It looks like the
Okay.
15 seconds was enough time for the body to recover, is what the data says.
Okay.
We're running a little over time, so I do want to get to the chat. So those of you, I think our moderators have been posting up some questions that are gathering in from our audience. So go ahead and get your questions in. We just talked about the pitch clock. Let's see. If fatigue is such a factor, how does that correlate? That is, sorry. These are incomplete questions here. Okay, here's one. What about the hardness of the pitcher's mound and the surface of baseball? You're trying to throw an object that has a slippery surface and cannot be gripped. But you're trying to throw hard where the floor is hard, like concrete, and your feet cannot stand on it. Could this put strain on either your elbow or shoulder? And maybe Dr. Nicholson or Mike could answer that question.
Kristen, all you.
Yeah, I don't know. I not sure how the surface of the mound plays a role in the force is in stress on the elbow. And I don't know that anybody has done a study. There's one study out there that's still trying to be published, I think. I don't know. That compares a turf mound to a dirt mound, but I don't think anybody has specifically looked at like a softer surface and whether or not that reduces elbow torque. I think it would reduce the ground reaction forces, which in turn may end up reducing the elbow torques, but it probably would also reduce velocity because there's just not as much energy transfer. So it may be an backward solution, kind of like increasing the ball weight, where it has an effect, but it is an effect of decreasing velocity as well. I'm not sure. Glenn, do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm thinking a lot less smart than you are. I just think if the mound is not too hard or not too soft, where the person could do his proper mechanics, then I don't think it's such a big factor. If it's too hard or too soft, and if he slips or can't do the right stride length, then I think it might be a factor.
Right. And just a reminder that the ground reaction force is in 3 dimensions, right? So it's vertical and then, that what we call the front, back, and side to side. This is actually an interesting question. What are your thoughts on workload monitoring tools for young pitchers who operate in arenas where markerless motion capture is not typically available?
Maybe Mike could talk about the
Mike?
driveline pulse law.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that. I mean, so driveline pulse is a great tool to be able to measure workload. The only negative I think of that is you have to wear it for every throw for it to actually be useful, right? You have to be able to track every throw both in the game and just like throughout the week with pitching. But that is an excellent way for amateurs to do it. I think it's pretty affordable. It's not too expensive to purchase. I think that's an easy one. Pitch counts again, like it's only a small percentage of the overall workload of that. The other thing you can do is just track max intent, throws throughout the week and just try to like keep your eyes on the volume. But volume's only one key to workload. So luckily we can do something like the driveline pulse. I think that's a great tool.
This question is for Eno. Are there data to show an extra inning by the starting pitcher results in a reduction in bullpen ERA in the following game?
Yes, that's Louis Pollis, Pollis, wrote a piece recently. He used to be in the analytics department for the Phillies. If you want to read up on that, this piece is called "The Case for Leaving the Starter In," and then I just thought it was an interesting thing that like we can make that math work. We can incentivize teams to build starters that can go deeper, and that might mean less velo. But there could be a benefit to the bullpen. There could be a benefit that's on top of the depth itself. So.
If this is one question, if modern throwing programs are more advanced and specifically designed to prevent injuries, why are pitching injuries more prevalent than ever? As these programs continue to evolve, do you think we will eventually see a decline in injuries, or will the trend continue? I think this is the reason why we're doing the Major League Baseball and partnering up, right, Glenn?
Yeah, I think in a sense, it's very frustrating. My whole career, we're trying to prevent injuries, and there are more injuries than ever. But we've made pitchers bigger, stronger, and pitch better than ever before, and that's been coming with more force or torque. So I don't think it'll self-correct. I think we have essentially what the limiting factor is. Our research has shown that bigger people have bigger, stronger muscles, but they do not necessarily have bigger, stronger ligaments. So today's people are bigger and stronger, but the ligaments can't keep up with them. So we're in a situation where we've done too good of a job, and so we have to think about changing things. It won't self-correct.
Mike, you brought up periodization, all right? And somehow that's not standardized, especially in the off season. So if the issue is that, athletes, pitchers are not periodizing well, why aren't teams then prescribing programs to their players to ensure adequate periodization? What are the barriers to doing this?
Yeah, I mean, I assume you're talking about the off season when they do it. I would love to do surveys anonymously, of course. I think a lot of athletes don't follow what their teams ask them to do in the off season. They're either going to their own consultants that are doing it on their own. And it's not like it was, 30 years ago where people weren't doing enough. They're probably doing more. So I think it just, comes back to just like everything else, like where the volume is just so high with the throwing, right? Like, Peter Chalmers came out with an excellent study a couple years ago that I think is probably the best study in baseball research this decade, that showed the UCL over the course of the season essentially got loose and swollen, and then over the course of an off season tightened back up and was less swollen. And again, it's amazing how people misinterpret that data as well as all the other data that you see out there. And some people say, well, that means, oh, it got bigger. It must be getting hypertrophied. But that's not how ligaments work, right? Ligaments are a lot different than muscles and tendons, right? That's damage. That's like, inner substance damage of the UCL. So I think the biggest thing we need to do is we need to understand that there needs to be adequate periods where the whole arm can recover, right? Two studies the last couple of years just came out that showed again that forearm muscles were more elastic after an outing, and the joint width was wider, right? We see these things that are happening over and over and over again. We have to build in these periods. So many people will say that we have to throw more. The reason why we're having so many injuries is because we're babying our players. But I'm telling you, that is the furthest thing from the truth. None of these people are being babied. They are all overthrowing at such a critical level. I can't explain it.
So that said, much like position players, are there any types of equipment, I assume modalities, which can be worn to minimize stress on the pitcher's arm? I think they're talking about sleeves and things like that. Kind of hit or miss on that. Mike, you could take that, and I'll open it up to the rest of the panel.
Yeah, I mean, no, probably not. I mean, I don't think there's
Yeah.
something out there. If something were to probably take torque off, it would probably do it in a way that would also decrease velocity or change their kinematics, I would imagine too. So it would be pretty limiting and probably not going to work.
There are a few companies that are trying to make selling kind of tight sleeve, tight shirts to try to take some of the load off, but I'm not sure if any of them have been proven to be effective.
You got a few of those shirts,
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
Glenn?
Yeah.
In the lab. I'm intrigued with the 6-ounce ball. Do you have ideas as to how that will change grip and/or forearm health? How does the ball size differ?
Well, we actually tried 5-ounce, 9.25 inch, and 9.1 inches, which is the standard, and we tried 6-ounce, same size, but we also tried 5% bigger circumference. So it's instead of 9.1, it's 9.6. It's just it's 5% bigger. So that's what we are suggesting to move forward on the research, trying a 5-ounce bigger, 1-ounce heavier ball. As far as the grip goes, again, I don't know, I don't have it worked out yet, but again, I think these balls are kind of small in today's big guys' hands. So 5% is not much of a change. I think it might be a good factor. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, to counter argue that, you're giving the 9-inch ball to a 7-year-old and asking them to pitch. So if they can grip it, then this big major league guy should be able to grip one that's 5% bigger in circumference.
Yeah, I just want to say, Kristen, Dr. Nicholson has published recent papers saying, I'm saying the big guys should use bigger, heavier balls. Kristen, you want to just mention what your study did about the little guys, the
Yeah,
kids?
we were looking at whether it'd be advantageous for the 7, 8, 9-year-olds who are just learning kid pitch to use a smaller or lighter baseball. So we did 4-ounce and 3-ounce, and we did 5% reduced circumference. And the initial paper was just looking at if you reduce the size, does that increase the elbow torque due to an increase in arm velocity? And the initial paper showed that it did not. So it's safe and healthy to throw a smaller ball. And then we also did a study where they used that ball for an entire week, and we looked at their mechanics at the beginning of the week and at the end of the week. That hasn't been published yet, but mostly what we saw was there slight changes in mechanics, but not a lot over just the course of 1 week. But the thought process there is that if you can teach these 7, 8, and 9-year-olds to grip the ball correctly, and throw with proper mechanics on top of the ball instead of having to be underneath the ball at an earlier age, can you, 1, decrease the risk of injury with proper mechanics, and 2, increase their accuracy so that the load of pitching at Little League can be spread out more. Because right now, the biggest, most successful, most accurate player tends to get most of the pitching load. So if we can spread it out, then perhaps these overuse at the really young age will maybe decrease.
Hey,
Yeah,
Glenn.
you want to add to that, or?
I'm sorry.
I was just agreeing. I mean, yeah, the guy who can throw strikes, throws all the time.
Glenn, I have an unpublished study with an N of 1. I'm the only subject, but I actually injured my UCL personally throwing a softball when I coached my daughter's softball teams for many, many years. So that was a 6-ounce ball, so in larger, so 11 inch at their age at the time. So an N of 1, but I wasn't a fan. So
I do want to say, when we're talking about the weighted ball programs that Mike was talking about before, the weighted ball programs, as you may be familiar with, again, a baseball is 9 inches or so and 5 ounces. They use balls that are lighter than 5 ounces as well, maybe 3 or 4 ounces, and balls that go up to 16 ounces or a pound or 2 pounds. So the weighted ball programs have a wide range of ball weights, and it's not just the 5 versus the 6 ounce. Yeah.
Let's see, what modalities seem beneficial in season? We have found some interesting result with dry needling collegiate pitchers this spring, mostly in the flexor pronator mass, tricep regions. Any thoughts of alternative modalities?
I mean,
BFR, yeah.
what we tend to focus on is what happens to the body from throwing. So, what we teach the athletes is you get tight and you get tired, right? We've been talking about essentially both of those. So the cumulative eccentric trauma of deceleration at that speed, causes tightness in certain muscle groups. And our theory is if you pitch on that with that fatigue or with that tightness, then obviously you're going to put yourself in a little bit more of a disadvantageous position. So for us, it's really anything, but we want to restore you back to your normal motion and get rid of the fatigue as much as we can before you pick up a ball again. So there's lots of things, for fatigue. There's things like Mark Pros or Complex, like neuromuscular stim devices that can help with that a little bit. There's soft tissue work, obviously for the range of motion type things. We use laser quite a bit. Lasers helps mitochondria work harder to help recover again. So there's many things you can do, but lots of different ways you can skin a cat. But the goal again is to restore their mobility before they pick up a ball again, because if you don't, they're going to play catch with that ball and their mobility is going to come back, but it's going to be a lot more stressful for it to come back in the middle of a catch session than if we help them on the table get that motion back.
Dr. Fleisig, this is for you. You mentioned the issues you have with single throw calculations when it comes to workload systems. There are 4 major workload models out there today, with many more behind the curtain of MLB orgs. Have you experimented with other throwing load calculations that might weight higher intensity throws, or do you have a preference outside of the modus calculation of old?
Yeah. So the modus calculation to calculate one pitch calculates the torque, but then to calculate workload, they take the stress or the torque in that pitch and put it to an exponent of 1.3. I know this became very mathematical, but what that means is that if 2 throws are 50 Newton meters and 1 throws 100 Newton meters, that's not the same amount of total load. The 100 Newton meters raised to an exponent makes it higher. So I think that answers the question that we've been using an equation where the stress on each throw is raised to an exponent of 1.3, which means the higher the throw, it gets exponentially more important in the workload.
And does that add to the cumulative
Definitely.
workload? Because I know
Yeah,
it does
it adds to the
cumulative.
cumulative as well as the acute. Yeah, it adds to both.
Let's see. You mentioned that increasing pitchers' aerobic capacity may help with longevity and performance, aka durability. Do you know of any study on this, or do you know if pitchers wear heart rate monitors while pitching? Anyone want to take that? That could
I
be an
know some.
initiative, right? Moving forward. You know,
So some orgs do that. I know that some orgs actually, have players do that, especially in the minor leagues, to kind of monitor that again. And it's looking at their capacity, right, and trying to just, use another metric for workload and capacity development.
Yeah, just to add to that,
go ahead.
the only no, the only thing I would add to that is just that when it comes to stuff like that, it gets a little bit problematic with the players union and just ownership of data. I know that there's a lot of advancements that can be made with Whoop and Aura and Catapult data, but you have to have full buy-in from the player and so you don't always get that across the board because there's not necessarily a level of trust between player and organization all the time. So when it comes to sort of biometrics and things like that, I do think that they can help us in the future, but there's always sort of a roadblock there, which is just that relationship between organization and player and wanting to, as a player, you could say like, oh, are you going to judge me based on things that I can't control or things beyond my control? Or is this going to come up in arbitration? Is my VO max going to come up in arbitration? Or is this going to be the reason you trade me? So, it is, maybe there's something that has to be changed on the culture level, but when players buy in and do that on their own, I think they find it's useful information. So maybe just time will help us on that one too.
Well, to your point, if we somehow can incorporate workload, whether that's through, Pulse or some of these other ratios, could we do that at the amateur level and the younger levels? Like, can we build on PitchSmart to communicate workload ratios, however that's calculated, to parents, to coaches, in a simple way, right? That by the time to get the big leagues, that's, a little more controlled. We have a better idea of their aerobic capacity moving forward.
Yeah, finding real simple top line takeaways that you can broadcast. I think FitSmart is the great idea. I think we need to add to it.
Yep. Let's see. I'm trying to get through everyone's questions. Thank you, by the way, everyone. I apologize in advance if I can't get to everybody. This one, when it comes to increasing ball weight, were predictions/observations made on differences in arm slot or elbow flexion? In a sort of extreme comparison, quarterbacks throw a heavier ball closer to their head in terms of elbow flexion and have experienced less elbow injury.
I'll take that. In this study we just did here with the 5 and 6 ounce baseball, I didn't mention I didn't have time, but we looked at the full biomechanics, and there was essentially no differences in the biomechanics throwing the 5 or 6 ounce as far as the elbow angle and the stride length and everything like that. There have been shown those significant differences when you throw a football or a baseball that's twice the weight, or a softball, like when Mike Reinold got injured. When you throw things that are bigger or heavier, you do have more elbow flexion. You hold the ball closer to your head, and you have more horizontal adduction, kind of pushing the ball. And so there are differences, but we don't see it with the 5 to 6 ounce. We see it with the more extreme differences of ball weight.
This is actually an excellent question. Are other leagues around the world, NPB, KBO, etc., experiencing the same increase in pitching-related injuries? Or do we simply don't know?
I could talk about that a little bit. I think that in Japan, like the injury reporting is not the same. The teams don't necessarily give you all the details of what the injury was. They don't tell you sometimes you don't even know about the surgeries. Like there's just less information. And so people to some extent have I think missed actual injuries that were happening there because they weren't reported, or they weren't reported the same way that we're used to. And there's also a fundamental difference in Japan in that they all get a day off every week. So, you know, they have a different schedule. I would
Once
say
you-
that
Sorry,
there's
go ahead.
probably there's probably something to it. There probably is a little bit less injury in Japan, but they also don't throw as hard. So it's kind of hard to compare them, is basically what I'm saying.
Right, I agree with Eno that they are smaller, the Japanese pro pitchers, than the major league pitchers, and they throw with less velocity, less torque. And we've actually compared the torque of their pitching, and so they do have less torque. I find that they report less in the medical literature in Japan, and also I feel like they are on the same line as us, but they're a step behind. So their experience, what we experienced 15 years ago, right now, or 10 years ago. And right now they have a good number of injuries, but they proportionally have more shoulder injuries than elbow injuries, which is how our pitchers used to be. So unfortunately, I think they're progressing towards us. But right now, shoulder injuries are just as a big problem to them, and they haven't shifted to mostly elbow injuries like we have.
This question, it says, the graph on Tommy John operations for top draftees in the last 20 years is almost violent in terms of changes. Any explanation for that?
Well, there's how many Tommy John surgeries the guys got drafted coming in with?
The ones
Yeah,
getting drafted
there's
coming in.
I
Correct.
talked to the guys at MLB, and I think they believe it's twofold. One is that there are more high school and college pitchers who are getting Tommy John surgeries, for sure. The other one is teams are less scared to draft a guy with a history of a Tommy John surgery because they have good outcomes. So there are more injuries, but the teams are also not shying away from drafting those guys. Mike, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I would agree.
Let's see. Look back to velo. Velocity has always been the metric that caught the scouts' attention. In years past, velocity got pitchers to the big leagues, but once they got there, they learned how to get outs without throwing every pitch at max intent. Why the change?
I don't agree with the first part of the sentence that velocity has always been the thing that people used to get drafted on their ERA and strikeouts and if they look good and everything like that, not just all focus on velocity. You know, I don't know if you agree from the professional level that there's more focus on the teams drafting velocity versus drafting pitchers.
I mean, I think that, like, to be drafted in the first 2 rounds, there's a number you have to hit. You have to you have to at least touch 97 basically to be drafted in the first 2 rounds. So there's almost just a proliferation of velocity to the point where, yeah, there are these secondary things that they look at, but you have to throw that hard to be in the conversation. So
But it wasn't
it's
like that. It wasn't like that back when you started, though, was it?
yeah, I don't think so. And I mean, you can just look at the overall velo since we started tracking at 89 to 94 last year. It's going up and up and up. I guess to defend why teams do this, it's like, you know, you do studies, you do stuff type studies, and you're like, you know, we had a general manager say, you know, when they say this to a journalist, you know that it's already, everyone believes it and there's no edge to be had. But the general manager of the Angels once said that velo was the #1 predictor of future success for a pitcher. So when you do a study like that, then you start to really care about that.
All right, you start hyper focus on velo. Dr. Nicholson, how do we bridge the gap between lab biomechanics and quote unquote field/practitioner biomechanics?
By putting biomechanics on the field. I think that's the start.
Yeah, we're there, right?
And you know, getting some research going in areas that have both, you know, see how comparable they actually are, and if what you're doing in the lab is even really representative of what's happening on the field, because I think there is a big question around that for, you know, people who don't have field biomechanics. You know, somebody goes to a lab, but is that even comparable? Like, we know that they throw slower in the lab. I'm sure you see this to Dr. Fleisig, there's no crowd, there's no pressure. They're just going to throw slower in the lab. It's a weird environment, and that's what it is. And so if you're throwing slower in the lab, is that also changing your mechanics? We don't really know. So I think the first step is to get access to field biomechanics, and then see some comparisons on whether or not those are even similar enough to make an argument that all these
Arnel,
studies are
Arnel,
transferable.
maybe the viewers know, but or the question person, but do you want to explain a little what is happening with Major League Baseball and do teams have biomechanics and explain what's happening here?
Yeah, so every Major League Baseball team has in-game or in-stadium motion capture systems that allow them to estimate basically biomechanics of in-competition play, not just for the pitchers, but also for hitters. There's been work, in my lab and, Kristen's lab, we've all been kind of involved over the years of trying to validate, or at least trying to measure the equivalence of these systems with other systems. But I think regardless of the modality that's used to capture motion, I think the ultimate question is which one of these metrics are useful or actionable for the coaches and players? Like, how do we bridge that gap? We're moving in that territory, if you will. But I think over time, once the coaches, players understand a little bit more on the value that biomechanics can provide as a tool, then perhaps that could be more useful from an injury risk mitigation. That's kind of my quick thoughts right there.
Yeah, I would think that more studies tying the biomechanics to injury risk, velocity, and stuff would be how to get them interested in the mechanics and how they can use it to coach their players.
All right, we are just about done, a little bit over. Any last thoughts, real quickly? 15 seconds.
Oh, just thanks for having me. And this was a really interesting conversation. And I hope the MLB listens to everybody on this panel and we start to get some real funding for this type of research that comes from baseball. Maybe some sort of brain sharing. I don't know. Because I know you guys are providing, edges to your teams as well. And so, some stuff won't ever get shared because if it's an edge, it's an edge. But if there's any way we could sort of have a collective brain on this, I would be all for that.
Yeah. Mike?
Yeah, again, thanks for having me on this as well. And hopefully I think this leads to, future developments that I think are going to be worthwhile. And it will. Major League Baseball is doing a great job even just starting this. And I know they're already starting to talk about the next steps after this. I hope that some rule changes and other things that can go into effect. I hope it doesn't ruin a whole generation of pitchers that have been training a certain way, and then we change the rules. It might not work great for them at that time. So hopefully we can mitigate that as much as we can. But as long as the game is focused on success and outcome based on velocity, we're going to keep having this conversation. It's more about how do we mitigate it, not how do we stop it.
Dr. Nicholson?
Thanks for having me as well. Yeah, I think that this is a great start. I think there needs to be a kind of a shift in how we think about it. They can't just be chasing velocity and throwing max the whole time. But the change is going to start with the coaches and making them aware of this. And I think just putting this report out there is the first step to making people aware of what is contributing to these issues.
Dr. Fleisig,
Okay,
take us home.
I'm optimistic. I'll tell you why. Because a few years ago, baseball was pretty boring to watch on TV, okay? And what did they do? Major League Baseball studied the situation. They tried some things in minor leagues, and they did some research, and then they put some things in, such as the pitch timer and bigger bases and things like that. And baseball is a lot more exciting to watch. So I think because of that model, I think we're on the road to do the same thing where we've now studied the problem. And I think Major League Baseball is going to take a little time. This is a tougher problem, but we're going to study it and try things. And then I think we are going to get there.
Cool. I want to thank all our panelists for, joining us for the last hour and a half or so and have this conversation. Again, this is a first step moving forward. Hopefully these initiatives will, get going and begin to tackle this epidemic. I want to thank our sponsors, American Baseball Biomechanics Society, as well as the Society of American Baseball Research, SABR. I believe that they will have a recording available, I don't know if they're YouTube, I'm sure they're going to get some kind of email. But thank you all for joining us, and hopefully we can continue this discussion moving forward. Have a great week and happy opening day.